The morning sun burned across the San Diego Naval Base, casting long shadows over rows of whitewashed buildings and the neat, sharp lines of sailors marching to duty. The base pulsed with energy jet engines roaring in the distance, boots striking. In rhythm, the smell of sea salt drifting in with the breeze. For the men and women in uniform, this was home. A world of rank, discipline, and respect. And in the middle of it all walked Michael Rowe. He carried a black leather folder tucked neatly under his arm. His steps were unhurried, his posture straight but unassuming. To most, he blended in with the faceless administrative staff who worked. Behind the scenes processing paperwork, answering phones, setting up meetings. Michael was always there, trailing half a step behind Commander Nathan Hayes, one of the Navy's most decorated SEALs. If Hayes was the storm, Rowe was the shadow that followed him. "Morning, Commander," a petty officer said crisply, saluting. Hayes, his eyes flicked briefly toward Michael, but only in the way one notices an assistant holding a briefcase. A polite nod, no more. Michael returned the nod without offense. He had lived this moment 1,000 times before. People saw Hayes. Trident pin, his rack of ribbons, his posture that screamed battle-tested leadership. They saw Michael as support staff, the aide, the man who carried folders, took notes, or poured coffee. It didn't bother him. Not outwardly. He had long ago made peace with invisibility. As they entered the administration building, Hayes leaned closer. "You good?" Michael gave a small smile. "Always." Hayes studied him, as if reading between the lines. But he didn't push further. Their friendship went back too far back to missions, whispered about in briefing rooms, and filed away in classified reports. Hayes knew the truth, even if the base didn't. Michael wasn't an aide. He wasn't a secretary. He wasn't there to carry anyone's folder. He was a Navy SEAL, a lieutenant commander, a man who had bled, fought, and survived missions that most never came home from. But here, on this base, he chose anonymity. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation that afternoon. Rows of sailors in dress whites sat ramrod straight, their shoes polished to mirrors. The air smelled faintly of starch and adrenaline. Families filled the back rows, whispering in excitement, cameras ready to snap at the first opportunity. Children squirmed on laps, clutching small American flags. It was a day of recognition, a day when the Navy honored its own. The stage gleamed under bright lights, draped in banners and the American flag. A podium stood at the center, waiting for speeches that would echo across the room. Michael stood quietly at the edge of the hall, near the side wall. He kept his folder against his arm, expression calm. From a distance, he looked like someone about to take attendance or distribute briefing notes. A young ensign, barely out of the academy, spotted him and smirked. He elbowed the sailor beside him. "There's Hayes' aide. Bet he's here to carry the commander's award paperwork." The sailor chuckled, not unkindly, just dismissively. To them, Michael was harmless, a background figure in a world built on visible rank and medals. Michael heard every word. His ears had been trained in war zones to catch the faintest shift of sound. He could hear fear in a man's breathing, deceit in a voice, betrayal in a pause. So yes, he heard the joke. But his expression never shifted, because he had heard worse, much worse. His silence wasn't weakness. It was choice. Commander Hayes caught his eye from across the room. He didn't laugh, didn't smirk. Instead, he gave the faintest nod, as if to say, "Hold steady. The moment's coming." Michael inclined his head slightly. He wasn't nervous, not exactly. But there was a heaviness pressing against his chest. Because this wasn't just another ceremony. This wasn't another day in the shadows. His name was written in the program. and not at the bottom. At the very top. The ceremony began with all the pomp the Navy could muster. The Master of Ceremonies stepped up to the podium, voice booming. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we gather to honor courage, sacrifice, and the relentless spirit of our Navy's finest." Applause swelled through the room. Sailors shifted with pride. Families clapped enthusiastically. Names were called, one by one. Officers and enlisted rose, marched forward, saluted, received medals. The audience applauded, the rhythm almost mechanical. Michael remained still. To anyone watching, he looked like a clerk recording the order of events. He clasped his hands loosely behind his back, his gaze calm, his posture neither too stiff nor too relaxed. But inside, the weight of memory stirred. Dust-choked air, the rattle of gunfire, the suffocating heat of body armor pressing against sweat-soaked skin. Voices over radio channels, some alive with urgency, others cut short mid-sentence. The flash of explosions tearing through night. The iron scent of blood and dirt mixing in a foreign land. He blinked once, drawing himself back to the present. The announcer's voice carried again. For extraordinary valor in Operation Red Dagger. The room quieted. Even the restless children stilled, as if sensing the gravity. Lieutenant. Commander Michael Rowe. The name rang through the hall. For a heartbeat, silence. Then a ripple, like wind through tall grass. Heads turned sharply, whispers spreading. People craned their necks to look toward the side wall. The smirking ensign's eyes widened, face draining of color. Sailors exchanged confused glances. Michael Rowe? Him? The Aide? The folder carrier? The shadow? And yet, there he was, stepping forward, calm and steady, every movement deliberate. Michael walked toward the stage, the folder gone from his arm. His stride was measured, his uniform pressed to perfection, his shoulders squared with quiet authority. The murmurs grew louder, echoing off the auditorium walls. He passed row after row of stunned faces. Some looked embarrassed, others awestruck. A few seemed almost ashamed of their earlier indifference. But Michael's gaze didn't waver. He wasn't here for their validation. Commander Hayes sat straighter, pride etched into every line of his expression. Michael mounted the steps to the stage, boots ringing against the polished wood. The hall felt charged, electric. And as he approached the Admiral waiting at center stage, something remarkable happened. The Admiral's right hand rose sharply, fingers pressed to brow, delivering a crisp salute. Gasps erupted. Tradition shattered. Admirals didn't salute. Aides, they didn't salute first to subordinates. But this Admiral did. That was the moment the room realized who Michael Rowe truly was. Not the aide, not the shadow, not the paper pusher. He was the man who led warriors into the jaws of hell. The man who refused to abandon anyone. The man whose courage had been hidden until now. The applause thundered. But to Michael, it was only the beginning. Because honor was never about recognition. It was about sacrifice. And his story was only just beginning to be told. The Admiral's salute still hung in the air when Michael lowered his hand. Applause rolled through the auditorium, but to him it sounded muffled, as though he were underwater. The roar of hundreds clapping couldn't silence the ghosts that stirred at the mention of his name. Lieutenant Commander Michael Rowe. For most in the room, the revelation was shocking. For Michael, it was a reminder. The Navy didn't speak the name without attaching shadows to its shadows, from a place half a world away, from a mission most dared not recount, from memories written in blood. The announcer continued his speech, but Michael barely heard the words. He stood tall, saluting, acknowledging, performing the ritual motions drilled into him through years of service. Yet his mind drifted, flicking back to images he couldn't erase. It was supposed to be a reconnaissance op. That's how Operation Red Dagger had been briefed. Quiet, surgical, in and out. His platoon had studied satellite images, rehearsed. Movements, calculated risks. Everything had been precise. Until the first explosion tore through their convoy. The enemy had been waiting. The trap closed around them with ruthless precision. Michael's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight as the Admiral pinned the metal to his uniform, but the pinning wasn't what he felt. He felt the weight of the night when gunfire ripped across their position, when radios screamed with desperate calls for air support, when men cried out in pain, when silence fell over names he knew by heart. He remembered carrying Sergeant Daniels across rocky terrain, bullets snapping inches overhead. He remembered dragging Chief Simmons by his harness, refusing to let go even when his own legs screamed with exhaustion. He remembered the unbearable heat of fire swallowing their extraction point. And he remembered one promise: nobody gets left behind. The crowd erupted again, but Michael's eyes had already moved past them. Somewhere near the back, he caught sight of a family, a woman clutching two small children, their eyes wide and confused. He didn't know them personally, but he knew their type. A widow. Children who would grow up hearing stories about a father who never came home. The Navy called it sacrifice. Families called it absence. Michael called it failure, even when others told him he had saved more lives than anyone could have expected. He had brought most of his team home, but most was never enough. Commander Hayes approached from his seat as the Admiral stepped aside. He clasped Michael's hand firmly, leaning close so only he could hear. They needed to see this. Hayes whispered. They needed to know who you are. Michael's eyes flicked toward the sailors in the front row. The young ensign who had called him a paper pusher earlier was staring, his face pale, mouth slightly open. He wasn't mocking now. He wasn't smirking. He was seeing what everyone else was seeing. The quiet Aide wasn't quiet at all. Michael gave Hayes the faintest nod. I didn't do it for them. The Admiral returned to the podium, his voice carrying across the hall. When we speak of valor, we speak of actions that go beyond the call of duty. Lieutenant Commander Rowe exemplified this in Red Dagger. He fought through overwhelming fire, refused evacuation, and carried his brothers to safety under conditions no man should have survived. He chose mission before self, comrades before comfort, and courage before fear. Applause thundered again. Michael's face remained still, disciplined, unreadable. He wasn't performing humility. It was genuine. He didn't crave these words. In fact, they cut deeper than silence, because he remembered every name the Admiral didn't say. After the ceremony ended, people surged forward. Sailors who had once passed him by now lined up to shake his hand. Families reached out, thanking him for service they couldn't begin to imagine. Some spoke words that blurred together. Hero, bravery, legend. Michael nodded politely, said little. Words like those belonged to myths, not men. The young ensign finally reached him, eyes downcast. Sir, I owe you an apology. I didn't realize. Michael studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm. Respect isn't about who you think someone is. It's about how you treat them before, you know. The ensign swallowed hard, nodding quickly. Lesson delivered. Later that evening, Michael stepped outside into the cooling air. The sun had dipped low, painting the Pacific in streaks of orange and crimson. He walked toward the pier, needing distance from the applause, the noise, the weight of too many eyes. Commander Hayes followed at a respectful distance before catching up. You okay? Hayes asked. Michael leaned against the railing, staring out at the endless horizon. Okay enough. You didn't want this ceremony, did you? Michael shook his head. No, I didn't want any of it. Recognition doesn't bring them back. Hayes, was quiet, then placed a hand on his shoulder. But it reminds the living. Michael let the silence stretch, broken only by the crash of waves against the pier. In the reflection of the water, he saw flashes of the men he'd lost. He heard their laughter, their arguments, their voices echoing in his mind. They weren't ghosts to him. They were living in every decision he made, every step he took, every silence he kept. He closed his eyes, inhaled the salt air, and finally exhaled slowly. The Admiral's salute replayed in his head, sharper than the applause, louder than the speeches. That gesture had meant something. Not pomp, not politics, respect. As the base quieted for the night, Michael walked back to his quarters, passing sailors who now saluted him with crisp precision. He returned, each one calmly, acknowledging them without arrogance. Inwardly, though, he thought of something else. They assumed he had been just the SEAL's aide, but after tonight, they would know. Not because of a medal, not because of a title, but because respect, once earned in blood, never fades. And for the first time in years, Michael allowed himself a thought he rarely entertained. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding. The base had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Floodlights hung along the walkways, illuminating the neat rows of barracks. The clang of boots against metal staircases echoed faintly in the distance. A few sailors laughed outside the mess hall, their voices carrying in the cool evening air. For most, it was an ordinary night. For Michael Rowe, it was anything but. He sat at the desk in his quarters, the medal from the ceremony resting beside him. Its polished surface gleamed under the lamp, catching the light each time he shifted. He hadn't put it away. He hadn't worn it. He simply let it sit, staring at it as though it might burn through the wood. The room was silent, but inside Michael's head, it wasn't. Gunfire, explosions, voices cut off mid-sentence. He rubbed his temples, willing the memories to quiet. But Operation Red Dagger wasn't a story you shut away. It was carved into his bones, stitched into his skin, buried deep in his chest where no applause or salute could reach. A knock at the door broke the silence. Michael hesitated before answering. Yeah? The door opened, and Commander Hayes stepped inside, carrying 2 beers. He set one on the desk, the other in his hand. Figured you'd be in here brooding. Michael gave him a sidelong look. I don't brood. Hayes smirked. You're sitting in the dark, staring at a medal. That's as close to brooding as it gets. Michael leaned back in his chair. You didn't have to come. Sure I did, Hayes replied, dragging a chair across the floor and sitting opposite him. You think I'm gonna let you spiral tonight? Not happening. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the ocean faint in the distance. Finally, Hayes leaned forward. You've been carrying this for years, Mike. Red Dagger, the losses, all of it. But today, that salute, that wasn't just about you. That was for every man who didn't come home. The Admiral knew that. Michael's jaw tightened. And what about the ones I couldn't save? You saved more than anyone could have asked for. Not enough, Michael said quietly. His voice was steady, but the weight behind it was crushing. It'll never be enough. Hayes took a long pull from his beer, eyes never leaving Michael. You know, people on this base thought you were just my aide. They looked at you and saw a guy who carried folders. You let them believe that. Why? Michael shrugged. Easier that way. Less questions. Less eyes. But hiding doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't make the ghosts go away. Michael stared at the medal again, its reflection distorted in the glass of his beer. Maybe not. But it makes the noise quieter. Hayes shook his head. No, brother. It just makes it lonelier. Later that night, Michael found himself walking again. The pier had always been his refuge, a place where the steady crash of waves drowned out the chaos in his head. He leaned on the railing, watching the moonlight ripple across the water. He thought of Daniels, Simmons, Reyes, and Carter. Their faces came unbidden, sharp and clear. Daniels with his crooked grin, Simmons with his quiet humor, Reyes always tapping his helmet for luck before missions, Carter humming country songs under his breath. All gone now, their voices silenced in that valley overseas. Michael clenched his fists. I should have done more. The memory returned with brutal clarity. The ambush had been swift. Their convoy disabled, pinned down. The enemy outnumbered. Them 5-1. Michael had ordered his men into a defensive circle, returning fire with everything they had. The air was thick with smoke and dirt, every breath tasting like ash. Daniels had been hit first, blood soaking his sleeve. Michael dragged him behind cover, ignoring his own burning lungs. Simmons went down next, shrapnel tearing through his leg. Michael pulled him by his harness, refusing to let go even as bullets sparked inches away. Every second was survival, every decision a gamble. The extraction point was on fire, smoke billowing skyward. Their radios crackled with chaos, support delayed by the storm. The enemy pressed harder, their shouts echoing through the valley. Michael remembered yelling till his throat was raw, ordering his men to keep moving, to stay alive. He carried Daniels across the rocks, muscles screaming in protest. He dragged Simmons even as his own knee buckled from the weight. He fought, not just with bullets, but with sheer willpower. But Reyes and Carter, they hadn't made it. Their names still tore at him like open wounds. Michael gripped the railing of the pier until his knuckles whitened. The ocean roared below, indifferent to his torment. You think you could have carried them all, a voice said behind him. Michael turned to see Hayes again, hands in his pockets. I should have, Michael muttered. Hayes shook his head. You carried as many as any man could. More, probably. But you're not a machine, Mike. You're human. You bled like the rest of us. And you still stood when others couldn't. Michael looked away. Doesn't feel like standing. Maybe. Not to you, but to the rest of us? It does. They walked back in silence, the weight of their shared memories unspoken but understood. At his quarters, Michael paused. Hayes, why do you stay by me? After all these years? Hayes smiled. Faintly. Because you carried me too, once. Don't think I've forgotten. You've spent so long believing you're just the guy in the shadows. But you're more than that. You've always been more. Michael let the words sink in, but didn't. Answer. That night, lying in his bunk, he closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come easy. It never did. But for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder. Maybe the Admiral's salute wasn't just about respect. Maybe it was a reminder that the shadows couldn't hold him forever. The Admiral's salute had lasted only seconds, but its weight lingered far longer. By morning, the story had already spread across the base. Sailors whispered in corridors, officers spoke in hushed tones, and recruits who hadn't even attended. The ceremony repeated it like legend. The Admiral saluted him first. It was the kind of detail that became myth overnight. For most, it was unheard of, unthinkable. Admirals commanded respect by default. They didn't extend it so freely. To salute first was more than recognition. It was reverence. And Michael Rowe, the man everyone thought was just a SEAL's aide, had earned it. As Michael walked across the base the next day, he felt the difference immediately. Salutes snapped. Sharper. Eyes followed him longer. Conversations hushed when he passed. He hated it. Not the respect. He understood that. What he hated was the attention. For years, he had built a life in the background, a deliberate choice. Blending in meant safety. Silence meant control. Now, suddenly, the shadows were gone, replaced with a spotlight he hadn't asked for. Two sailors straightened nervously as he approached, offering salutes. "Good morning, sir," one stammered. Michael returned the salute with calm precision. "Morning." His voice carried no arrogance, only the same quiet steadiness he'd always had. Yet the sailors watched him go, as if they'd just spoken. To a legend, in the mess hall, the whispers continued. "That's him, the one from Red Dagger." Admiral saluted him first. No kidding. Michael sat alone with his tray, deliberately choosing a corner table. He ate in silence, though the food had no taste. Across the room, Commander Hayes joined a group of younger SEALs. They laughed and joked, but their eyes kept flicking toward Michael. Hayes eventually stood and walked over, sitting opposite his. "Old teammate, you're famous now." Michael shook his head. "Fame fades." "Not this kind," Hayes countered. "This sticks. That salute's gonna follow you everywhere." Michael stabbed his fork into his eggs. "I didn't earn it alone." "You don't have to explain that to me." Later that afternoon, Michael was called into the Admiral's office. The aide outside, a young lieutenant with a stiff posture, seemed almost too nervous to announce him. "Sir, Lieutenant Commander Rowe is here." "Send him in," came the deep voice from inside. Michael entered, standing at attention. The Admiral looked up from behind his desk, eyes sharp but not unkind. He gestured for Michael to sit. "I imagine yesterday was uncomfortable for you," the Admiral began. Michael gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." The Admiral leaned back, folding his hands. "Good. Comfort breeds complacency. Men like you weren't made for comfort." Michael remained silent, waiting. The Admiral studied him a moment longer. "You carried men out of hell, Rowe. You refused evacuation. You fought when others would have surrendered. Those actions deserve recognition." "With respect, sir," Michael said evenly, "the ones who didn't make it deserve it more." The Admiral's expression softened. "And you carry them with you? That's why I saluted you. Not because of medals, not because of reports, but because I saw a man who refuses to let sacrifice be forgotten." The words cut through Michael more deeply than he expected. He didn't answer, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside. When Michael left the office, Hayes was waiting. "How'd it go?" Michael exhaled slowly. "He sees more than I want him to." Hayes chuckled. "Admirals usually do." Together, they walked across the base. Michael noticed more salutes, more nods, more eyes following him. For years, he had been invisible. Now, visibility was inescapable. That evening, as he passed the barracks, a group of young recruits stood. At attention, one stepped forward nervously. "Sir, permission to ask a question?" Michael stopped, studying the boy. "Go ahead." The recruit swallowed hard. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" Michael paused, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Then he spoke quietly, "Because rank doesn't make the man. Actions do. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And it's not about who salutes you. It's about who you stand for when nobody's watching." The recruits exchanged glances, their faces lit with awe. They saluted him crisply before returning to their barracks, whispers already beginning to spread. Hayes smirked as they walked away. "You realize everything you say now is going to turn into a quote on someone's wall, right?" Michael gave him a look. "Then I should speak less." That night, Michael returned to the pier. The water shimmered under the moonlight, waves lapping against the wood. He sat with his jacket folded beside him, staring out into the endless horizon. For years, he had told himself anonymity was easier. That blending into the background was survival. That silence honored the dead more than speeches ever could. But the Admiral's salute had changed something. Not because it brought attention, he still hated that, but because it reminded him that respect wasn't about him. It was about the men whose stories he carried, the ones who would never walk this pier again. Michael closed his eyes, hearing their voices in the crash of the waves. Daniels, Simmons, Reyes, Carter. He whispered their names, as if speaking them aloud kept them alive a little longer. When he opened his eyes, the horizon stretched endlessly, the stars scattered like fire across the sky. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder if maybe stepping out of the shadows didn't mean betraying them. Maybe it meant honoring them. The salute wasn't for him alone. It was for all of them. And Michael Rowe understood, finally, that the world needed to see. The following week felt like walking through a storm Michael couldn't control. Everywhere he went, he saw the ripple effect of the Admiral's salute. A junior officer held open doors for him. Sailors stood straighter when he passed, even seasoned. Chiefs paused their conversations to nod respectfully. It wasn't hostility, it was reverence. But to Michael, it felt heavy. He hadn't asked for this. He had spent years carving out a quiet life in the margins, content to let his service. Records gathered dust in locked drawers. Now, suddenly, the spotlight was blinding. And it wasn't fading. One morning, Hayes found him pacing outside the command building. "You're wearing holes into the deck, Mike." Michael stopped, exhaling through his nose. "This isn't what I wanted." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "What? Respect?" "Attention." Hayes folded his arms. "You think hiding is respect for the men we lost?" "Because it's not. Every sailor who looks at you doesn't just see you. They see possibility. Proof that surviving hell doesn't mean disappearing afterward." Michael frowned, his silence answering more than words. Hayes clapped his shoulder. "Maybe it's time you stop asking if you deserve it and start asking what you're supposed to do with it." By the weekend, the ripple reached further. A message came down from Washington. Lieutenant Commander Michael Rowe was to attend a gathering of senior officers and veterans at the Pentagon. Michael resisted. "I'm not a speaker. I'm not a face for anything." Hayes grinned. "You survived Red Dagger, Mike. Talking to a few generals won't kill you." Michael scowled. "That's not funny." "Neither was Red Dagger. And yet, you're still here." Reluctantly, Michael agreed. He wore his uniform with crisp precision, but inside he felt unmoored. He hadn't stood in the Pentagon since before the ambush. The walls themselves seemed to whisper of battles past, of promises made and broken. The conference room was filled with stars, admirals, generals, senior staffers in tailored suits. Michael felt their eyes on him as he entered. Some nodded politely. Others whispered. One or two stared outright. He stood at attention, waiting for orders. The Admiral, who had saluted him first, was there, seated at the head of the table. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, "we're not here just to review policy. We're here because men like Rowe remind us of what policy is supposed to serve our people." A ripple of agreement circled the table. Michael kept his face impassive, but inside, his stomach knotted. Later, during a break, a retired general approached him. His voice carried the gravel of years. "Rowe, I read your report from Red Dagger, the official version." Michael gave a polite nod. "Yes, sir." The general leaned closer. "But the report doesn't explain how you carried 2 men under fire, refused medevac, and still led the last 6 to safety. Why isn't that in there?" Michael hesitated. "Because that's not the part that mattered." The general studied him, then gave a slow nod. "That humility. That's why the Admiral saluted you? Don't waste it." When the gathering ended, Michael slipped outside into the crisp DC night. The monuments stood tall in the distance, silent reminders of history carved into stone. Hayes joined him, carrying 2 coffees. Pentagon didn't eat you alive, Hayes said lightly. Michael took the cup, staring at the Washington Monument. They look at me like I'm more than I am. Maybe you are. Michael shook his head. No, I'm just a man who survived. Hayes sipped his coffee. And maybe that's exactly what they need right now. Someone who's not untouchable. Someone who bleeds. Someone real. Back at the base, the tension only grew. Reporters called. Veterans groups sent invitations. His inbox filled with messages from families who had lost sons and daughters in Red Dagger. One message in particular froze him. My brother was Reyes. He always spoke about you. He said if anything happened, you'd carry us in your heart. Thank you for proving him right. Michael read it 3 times before setting the screen down. His chest felt like it was splitting open. For hours, he sat in silence, the words echoing. He hadn't realized how much the families carried, how much they looked to him for meaning. The next morning, he walked to the pier before dawn. The horizon burned with streaks of orange and red, the sun fighting its way through the clouds. He thought of Reyes, Carter, Simmons, Daniels. Maybe this isn't about me, he whispered to the waves. Maybe it never was. Hayes found him. There, as always. You're starting to get it, huh? Michael looked at him, tired but steady. It's not about carrying the weight alone anymore. It's about making sure their weight isn't forgotten. Hayes smiled. That's the role, I know. That afternoon, Michael did something he hadn't done in years. He gathered the young recruits, the ones who had whispered in awe, the ones who saluted, a little sharper since the Admiral's gesture. He stood before them, hands clasped behind. His back. Most of you don't know me beyond rumors, he began. Some of those rumors are true. Some aren't. But what you need to know is this. Every medal, every salute, it isn't about one man. It's about all the men and women who stood beside him, who gave everything. The recruits listened in silence, hanging on every word. Michael continued, his voice low but firm. Don't chase glory. Don't chase recognition. Chase the man beside you. Protect him, because one day he might not come back. And if he doesn't, you carry him with you. That's the real mission. When he finished, the recruits didn't applaud. They didn't cheer. They stood, straight and silent, and saluted. Michael returned the salute, his chest tightening. For the first time, the weight didn't feel like chains. It felt like duty. He turned away, the sun casting long shadows across the parade ground. And for the first time in years, Michael Rowe walked toward the light. The first time Michael Rowe saw his name in a newspaper, he nearly tore it up. The headline read, Admiral salutes a quiet hero. The untold story of Lieutenant Commander Michael Rowe. The article didn't detail Red Dagger. It couldn't. Classified operations didn't make the front page. But it didn't need to. The story was simple, clean, powerful. An admiral, breaking protocol, honoring a man no one had heard of. The mystery itself became fuel. Who was Rowe? Why had he hidden? And why did he seem to shrink from the very recognition others would fight to claim? Michael tossed the paper aside. But the world wasn't done with him. Within days, the base public affairs office was overwhelmed. Interview requests poured in. Veteran groups wanted him as a keynote speaker. Families wrote letters. Networks called. Michael avoided it all. He slipped out of side doors, took late-night walks, and ate at odd hours just to avoid crowds. But anonymity was crumbling. One evening, Hayes found him sitting in the gym, alone, after midnight. The lights buzzed overhead, casting pale shadows across the mats. You can't dodge this forever, Hayes said, tossing him a towel. Michael caught it without looking. Watch me. Hayes shook his head. The world doesn't need another silent hero. They need a voice, maybe yours. Michael scowled. I didn't sign up to be anyone's voice. No, Hayes said quietly, but you already are. The dam finally broke when Michael received a package in the mail. The handwriting was shaky, the return address from a small town in Kansas. Inside was a folded flag, carefully wrapped, and a letter. Lieutenant Commander Rowe, this was my son's. He was Corporal Carter to you, but to me, he was just Adam. He told me before his last deployment that if anything happened, you'd be the one who remembered him. He believed in you. I want you to have his flag, because I know you'll carry him better than I can now. Michael sat frozen, the flag heavy in his lap. Hayes found him hours later, staring at it in silence. What is it? Hayes asked softly. Michael handed him the letter. Hayes read it slowly, then let out a long breath. You can't keep hiding, Mike. These families, they need you. Michael's throat tightened. And what if I let them down too? Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder. You won't? Days later, Michael stood before a veterans group in Washington. He wore his dress uniform, but the ribbons felt heavier than usual. Rows of faces stared up at him. Old soldiers in wheelchairs, young recruits in uniform. Mothers clutching folded flags, fathers with photographs in their hands. The room was silent as he stepped to the podium. He gripped its edges, steadying himself. Public speaking had never been his strength, but tonight wasn't about speeches. It was about truth. I'm not here because I wanted to be, he began. His voice was calm, even. I'm here because men I loved aren't, and I carry them with me every day. He told them of Daniel's crooked grin, Simmons' quiet jokes, Ray's helmet taps, Carter's country songs. He didn't describe the firefight in detail that belonged to those who had lived it, but he spoke of the silence afterward, the weight of loss, the emptiness of survival. And then he told them about the salute. It wasn't for me, Michael said, scanning the room. It was for them, for every man and woman who never made it home. If you take anything from me tonight, take this. The uniform doesn't belong to us. It belongs to them, to the families who wait, to the names carved in stone, to the ones who gave everything. The room rose in silence. No applause, no cheers. Just the quiet, unified act of standing. Michael's chest ached. But for the first time, it wasn't pain, it was purpose. The speech spread online within days. Veterans shared it, families passed it along, news anchors quoted it. Michael's words, simple, unpolished, carried more weight than polished speeches ever could. But with recognition came pressure. Reporters began following him outside the base. Strangers sent letters addressed only to the Quiet Seal. One morning, a camera crew waited outside the gate. Michael turned back immediately, jaw tight. This is why I didn't want it. Hayes caught up with him. You didn't ask for it, Mike, but maybe you were meant for it. Michael's eyes burned. Meant for what? Living while they died? That's no destiny. Hayes' voice softened. No, meant for reminding the world what sacrifice looks like. That night, Michael sat alone in his quarters, Carter's flag folded neatly on his desk beside the medal. He stared at them for a long time, the two symbols side by side, one given to him by the military, the other entrusted to him by a grieving mother. One meant honor, the other meant responsibility. He picked up the flag, pressing it to his chest. For the first time, he whispered, I'll carry him. I'll carry all of them. The words weren't for him. They were a promise. And in that moment, Michael Rowe finally understood. Stepping into the light wasn't about himself. It was about carrying their names where the world could see. The next day, he didn't dodge the press. He didn't avoid the salutes. He walked out of the base gates, shoulders squared, uniform sharp, carrying Carter's flag in his arm. Cameras clicked Microphones shoved forward. Voices shouted questions. Michael didn't flinch. He spoke calmly, evenly. This flag belonged to Corporal Adam Carter. His mother asked me to carry it for him. I will. And I'll carry the others too. Because this isn't about one man or one salute. It's about them. And I'll make sure they're never forgotten. The reporters fell silent. For once, even the cameras seemed to bow. That night, back on the pier, Hayes joined him as always. The moon shimmered across the water. "You did good today," Hayes said. Michael gave a small smile. "It's not about me anymore." "Maybe it never was." Hayes nodded. "No, brother. But it needed your voice." Michael gazed at the horizon, the waves carrying whispers of names he would never stop repeating. Reyes, Carter, Daniels, Simmons. The world had found its hero in Michael Rowe, but Michael knew the truth. He was only a voice. The real heroes were gone. And that, he decided, was exactly how it should be. The headline had appeared overnight. SEAL Hero Michael Rowe, the man the Admiral saluted first. By morning, it was on every military news site, trending across social media. Veterans shared it. Families reposted it. Civilians forwarded. Hashtags proliferated. Hashtag Quiet Hero, hashtag Red Dagger SEAL, hashtag Admiral Salute. Michael didn't read any of it. He refused. He left the morning briefing early, slipping through side corridors, avoiding the barrage of curious stares. But it was impossible to ignore. Recognition had begun to chase him, creeping into every corner of his life. Hayes intercepted him in the mess hall. Coffee in hand, he slid into the seat across from Michael. "You can't keep hiding, Mike. They've found you." Michael didn't respond. He stirred his food slowly, avoiding eye contact. "Listen," Hayes continued, voice gentle but firm. "You're a soldier, not a symbol, but people are looking for something real. And you are real. Don't waste this." Michael shook his head. "I don't want to be anyone's example. I don't want speeches. I don't want awards. I want quiet." Hayes sighed, leaning back. "Quiet won't come, brother. Not now, not ever again." By noon, Michael's phone buzzed relentlessly. Emails from reporters. Requests from veterans organizations. Letters from parents who had lost sons in Red Dagger. Invitations to speak. At ceremonies, at schools, at memorials. Each one was a reminder that he could no longer vanish. He read a particularly haunting email from a mother whose son had been killed the same day as Carter. "Lieutenant Commander Rowe, you were the last person Adam saw alive. He said you'd protect the others. I don't know if he ever thanked you. I hope you know we do. Please tell our story too. Make them live in memory, not just in a report." Michael stared at the screen. His chest tightened. He didn't know how to respond. Hayes approached silently, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do it alone, Mike. You never did." The next week, he found himself on live television. A veterans channel had requested an interview. The camera crew set up in a quiet corner of the base, lights glaring and microphones hovering. Michael's uniform gleamed under the artificial lights, his metal polished but heavy. The anchor's voice was warm but probing. "Lieutenant Commander Rowe, the Admiral's salute has captured the nation's attention. How did it feel to be honored in such a way?" Michael looked directly into the lens, choosing his words carefully. "I was never in this to be honored. I served because my teammates needed me. The salute, it was never for me. It was for them. For the men who didn't come home, and for the families who carry them every day." The anchor nodded, impressed. Michael's words carried weight, a resonance far beyond his own intention. Later, outside the studio, Hayes approached him. "See? That wasn't so bad." Michael shook his head. "I don't want to be famous. No one's asking you to be. But you are seen now. And what people see, they remember. Michael sighed. I feel like I'm betraying the quiet, the ones who never got a medal. I talk about the ones we lost, and yet, I'm standing here, alive, while they're gone. Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder. That's the point, Mike. You carry their story so it doesn't get lost. That's your job now. The emails kept coming. One was from a young SEAL, just out of training, nervous, barely able to type coherently. Sir, I wanted to say thank you for carrying us, for the courage you showed. I don't know if I'll ever be in your position, but I want to try. Please tell me how you kept going. Michael stared at the message, thinking of Carter, Daniels, Simmons, and Reyes. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had survived while others hadn't. And yet, maybe that was enough for someone else to believe in. He typed a response carefully. You carry your brothers with you. That's all any of us can do. Stay steady. Don't let fear take the lead, and never forget the ones beside you. One afternoon, Michael was approached by a congressional staffer while walking across the base. Lieutenant Commander Rowe, the woman began, stiff but polite. We'd like you to testify about your experiences during Red Dagger. It's important for veterans policy and for recognition of service members who go unheralded. Michael froze. Testify? Publicly? Yes. You're the only living witness who can speak without compromising operational security, sir. It's an opportunity to help others. He shook his head. I'm not a politician. I'm not a spokesperson. Then think of it as telling the truth, she replied softly. Not for fame, not for awards, but for them. That night, Michael walked to the pier. The water shimmered in the moonlight, waves whispering against the wood. Hayes joined him. Silently, the quiet presence comforting. Michael pressed Carter's flag against his chest. I don't know if I can do it, Hayes. I don't know if I'm ready to speak for all of them. I'm still just me. Hayes nodded. You're not alone. You never were. And the world needs you to be more than just you for a little while. It's not about stepping into the spotlight for yourself. It's about stepping in for them. Michael closed his eyes, letting the sound of the waves carry the voices of his fallen brothers. Their names whispered in the night. Daniels, Simmons, Reyes, Carter. He swallowed hard. Then I'll do it. But I'll do it my way. Quiet, steady. Truth first. Hayes smiled faintly. That's all anyone can ask of you. The following week, Michael's testimony before a congressional committee changed the tone of national discourse. Veterans and families watched live. As he spoke not of medals, nor glory, nor heroism in the abstract, but of loss, survival, and responsibility. I didn't go into combat to be remembered, he said, voice steady but low. I went because my team needed me. We all did. And those who didn't come home deserve more than silence. Their lives, their names, their families, those are the stories that matter. And it is my duty to carry them, so the nation never forgets. When he finished, the room remained silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, lawmakers and staffers began to stand slowly, until the entire chamber rose in unanimous applause. Michael did not bow. He only nodded, quietly acknowledging what he could not say aloud, that every name he carried lived on through him. That night, Hayes found him back on the pier, alone. Michael's uniform had been replaced with casual clothes, but his posture remained rigid, the weight of the day etched in every line of his face. They're listening now, Hayes said gently. Michael stared at the horizon. I don't want to be the hero. I just want them remembered. And you're doing it, Hayes replied. You're their voice, their memory. And that's worth more than any medal. Michael took a deep breath, the salty breeze washing over him. For the first time in years, He felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to survival or secrecy. Recognition didn't define him, but responsibility did. And Michael Rowe understood at last that sometimes stepping into the reluctant spotlight was the only way to honor those who could never step at all. The morning sun rose slowly over the base, spilling gold across the parade grounds. Michael Rowe walked alone, the medal still pinned to his uniform, Carter's flag tucked carefully under his arm. The quiet was a gift he had earned a rare moment before the day's demands arrived. He stopped at the edge of the pier, waves lapping softly beneath him. Hayes approached quietly, carrying 2 cups of black coffee. They stood in silence, watching the horizon. "Feels different now," Michael said finally. "How so?" Hayes asked. "I've realized it's not about me anymore. It never was. The medals, the salutes, they're just reminders. The real work is carrying their names." Hayes nodded, sipping his coffee. "You've done that, Mike, every day." That week, Michael traveled to Arlington National Cemetery. Families of the fallen had requested his presence for a small ceremony at the Red Dagger Memorial. Children clutched photographs of fathers they'd never see again. Mothers held tightly to folded flags. Fathers straightened in uniforms long, retired, their eyes fixed on the young SEAL who had been their son's last line. Michael stepped forward, quiet, measured. He held the flag over the memorial stone, letting it rest gently. "For every man who gave everything, every family who carries the silence, I carry this with you," he said. His voice was steady, unshaken by the grief surrounding him. Some cried. Some bowed their heads. Some simply stared, the weight of loss mirrored in Michael's own expression. He was one of them, yet apart, carrying what they could not bear alone. Later that day, back at the base, Michael returned to the pier. The sun had dipped low, streaking the water with crimson and gold. He closed his eyes, imagining Daniel's crooked grin, Simmons' quiet jokes, Ray's helmet taps, Carter's country songs. He whispered each name softly, letting the waves carry them. For years, he had carried them silently, privately. Now, the world had begun to understand. Recognition was no longer a curse. It was a tool, a way to honor their memory in every speech, every ceremony, every quiet moment on the pier. He let the wind brush against his face, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. Hayes approached with a small notebook. "You've been quiet today. Reflecting?" Michael nodded. "I think I finally understand. Carrying their names isn't about public attention or medals. It's about presence, showing up, telling the truth, giving families something solid to hold on to when the people they loved are gone." Hayes smiled faintly. "You make it sound so simple, but it's not. That's why we've needed you, all this time." Michael glanced at him, a half-smile breaking through. "I guess I've learned there's strength in being seen, even for someone like me." The next morning, Michael received a call from a family whose son had served under him during Red Dagger. They invited him to their home for a private remembrance. Hesitant, he agreed. When he arrived, the living room was filled with photographs and mementos. The family parents, a younger sister, and 2 cousins welcomed him like one of their own. "I've heard stories," the mother said softly. "Adam always said you were the one who made sure no one was forgotten." Michael nodded, swallowing. "Hard. I try, every day. I carry them with me, so their stories don't vanish." The father reached out, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. "You don't know how much that means. We feel like part of him is still here because of you." In the days that followed, Michael's role solidified. He became a quiet ambassador for the fallen, attending ceremonies, speaking at veterans gatherings, and visiting families. Each time, he carried the same message. It was not about heroism, fame, or recognition. It was about memory, duty, and presence. He refused grand speeches, avoided television appearances, and declined invitations. That turned him into a symbol. His strength was in authenticity, in quiet dedication. And the more he gave, the more the world seemed to understand. His humility became legendary. The salute that had sparked recognition transformed into something far deeper, an example of unwavering, selfless commitment to those who could no longer speak for themselves. One evening, after a long day at the base, Michael returned to the pier. Hayes joined him, as always, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The water was calm, reflecting the fiery streaks of sunset. "Think they'll ever stop calling you a hero?" Hayes asked, a faint grin on his face. Michael shook his head. "No, and I don't want them to. But I hope they understand that the real heroes are the ones who didn't make it home. I just carry their names." Hayes raised his cup. "To carrying names." Michael clinked his cup softly. "To carrying names." They stood silently, watching the waves, the wind brushing against them, the horizon endless and wide. Months later, the base held another ceremony, this time honoring a group of SEALs returning from a separate deployment. Michael stood at the edge of the parade ground, watching his families and comrades reunited. He caught the eye of a young lieutenant who hesitated before saluting. Michael returned it quietly, a small nod of encouragement, and the young officer's shoulders straightened. It was in moments like this that Michael understood his true role. Not a celebrity, not a symbol, not even a hero. Simply a man who refused to let the names of the fallen fade. That night, Michael walked to the pier one final time in this chapter of his life. The waves glistened under the moon, gentle and unyielding. He pressed Carter's flag to his chest and whispered all their names aloud. Daniels, Simmons, Reyes, Carter. Every teammate, every brother, every friend who had given everything. "I will carry you," he said softly. "I will make sure you are remembered, not just by me, but by everyone who looks for truth, everyone who needs to know your story." The wind carried his words across the water, and for the first time, Michael felt a lightness he had never known. Recognition didn't define him, but it had given him a purpose greater than survival. He smiled faintly, turning to Hayes. "Let's go home," Michael said. Hayes nodded. "Home?" And for the first time in years, Michael Rowe walked not with the burden of shadows, but with the quiet strength of someone who had carried the names of the fallen into the light, and in doing so, had found peace.